Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming to St. Agnes today. I'm Bonnie Phipps. I'm the president and CEO of St. Agnes, so it's my pleasure to officially welcome you here today. I hope you didn't have too much problem with the campus and getting around all of our activity here on campus, but I'll tell you, it makes me excited every time I see a new blockade go up. So hopefully it wasn't too bad for you. We're about 65% of the way through a $212 million renovation on this campus. And you're seeing what will be the beginning of a wonderful renaissance of delivering healthcare in a Catholic environment in Southwest Baltimore. We're really excited about our opportunity here to serve the population that surrounds us, and also our opportunity to welcome you to the second annual conference. We're here today to talk about something very important to Catholic medical professionals and Catholic hospitals, and that's the end-of-life care. Now more than ever, as medical advances move forward at a rapid pace, the potential for an ethical dilemma surrounding end-of-life care increases as well. We're thankful to the Archbishop for his interest in healthcare and his commitment to strengthening Catholic healthcare in Baltimore. I'm pleased to be able to offer a few words of introduction for Archbishop O'Brien. This is, we found out just a minute ago, his first visit here. We hope the first of many. We'll be hopefully bringing him back next year to bless our new opening of our building. The Most Reverend Edwin O'Brien is the 15th Archbishop of Baltimore. Archbishop O'Brien was ordained a priest at the Archdiocese of New York in 1965. From 1971 to 1972, he served a tour of duty in Vietnam, and I will tell you, my husband was there at the same time with you, Archbishop O'Brien, so I thank you for being there and blessing him as well. In 1996, he was named Auxiliary Bishop of New York, and then he became, on August 12, 1997, the Archbishop for the Archdiocese for the Military Services. That organization serves 1.5 million Catholics, including U.S. Armed Forces and their families, as well as 170 Veteran Administration hospitals and the United States government employees overseas. On July 12th of 2007, he was appointed Archbishop of Baltimore by Pope Benedict XVI. He succeeded, as you all know, Cardinal Keeler, who is still with us, sharing his blessings throughout Baltimore. We are so blessed to have Archbishop here with us today, and I would welcome him to the podium.
Thank you, Bonnie. Thank you all. Thanks for that fine introduction and welcome. It's a beautiful campus. I can just imagine what it's going to be a year from now, and I'm sure you're imagining that too. I'd like to begin with a prayer. It's a prayer of the Catholic Doctor by Pope John Paul II. Do you have copies of that there? I guess not. No. Okay. Divine Physician, who in your earthly life showed special concern for those who suffer and entrusted to your disciples the ministry of healing, make us ever ready to alleviate the trials of our brethren. Make each one of us aware of the great mission that is entrusted to him and her. Strive always to be, in the performance of daily service, an instrument of your merciful love. Enlighten our minds, guide our hands, make our hearts diligent and compassionate. Ensure that in every patient we know how to discern the features of your divine face. You who are the way, provide us with the gift of knowing how to imitate you every day as medical professionals, not only of the body but also of the whole person, helping those who are sick to tread with trust their own earthly path until the moment of their encounter with you. You are truth. Provide us with the gift of wisdom and science in order to penetrate the mystery of the human person and its transcendent destiny as we draw near to them, in order to discover the causes of their maladies and find suitable remedies. You who are the life, provide us with the gift of preaching and bearing witness to the gospel of life in our profession, committing ourselves to defending it always, from conception to natural end, and to respect the dignity of every human being, and especially the dignity of the weakest and the most in need. Make us, O Lord, good Samaritans, ready to welcome, treat, and console those we encounter in our work. Following the example of the holy medical doctors who have preceded us, help us to offer our generous contribution to the constant renewal of health care structures. Bless our studies and our professions, enlighten our research and our teaching. Lastly, grant to us, having constantly loved and served you and our suffering brethren, that at the end of our earthly pilgrimage, we may contemplate your glorious countenance and experience the joy of the encounter with you in your kingdom of joy and everlasting peace. Amen. As you know, every February there's a Feast of Our Lady and the World Day of the Sick. And Pope Benedict celebrated that this year and had some very relevant comments. He said, the Church, which is entrusted with the task of prolonging the mission of Christ over space and time, cannot ignore two essential activities, evangelization and caring for the sick in body and in spirit. He went on further to say, in fact, when the Word of God speaks of healing, of salvation, of the health of the sick, these concepts are meant in their integral significance, never separating soul and body. A sick person healed by the prayer of Christ through the Church is a joy on earth and in heaven, a first fruit of eternal life. So, as we discuss these profound issues in the medical profession surrounding the end-of-life care, suffering, human frailty, mortality, compassion, and faith in practice, we remember that so often those who care for the sick in body and spirit, and should remember them in our prayers, and they should be treated and healed spiritually as well as physically. This afternoon, I'd like to first thank our sponsors, St. Agnes Hospital, Bon Secours, Baltimore Health System, Mercy Medical Center, Good Samaritan Hospital, and St. Joseph's Medical Center. I'm very pleased to be able to welcome our speakers, Wesley Smith, Dr. Michael Bloth, Father Michael Descanis, and Dr. Marie Hilliard. Our keynote speaker is award-winning author and lawyer, Mr. Wesley J. Smith, a senior fellow at the Discovery Institute, an attorney for the International Task Force on Euthanasia and Assisted Suicide, and a special consultant for the Center for Bioethics and Culture. He left full-time practice of law in 1985 to pursue a career in writing and public advocacy. He has authored or co-authored 11 books, and his blog, Secondhand Smoke, which defends the unique moral value and importance of human life, is read by thousands of readers each week from all around the world. He frequently provides testimony for legislative bodies, executive committees, and is an international lecturer and public speaker. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Wesley Smith.
Good afternoon. I was very interested to listen to the introduction of the Archbishop, and it reminded me of being in Texas, and I was on a dais with Bishop Gracida of Texas, and he talked about, and he was introduced as having fought in World War II and having been in the Flying Fortress airplanes that bombed Germany. And Bishop Gracida got up and he said, yes, there was a June day over Munich when I was on a bombing run, and on the ground, manning an anti-aircraft battery, was a young man named Ratzinger who had been drafted into the army to fight, and he was manning the anti-aircraft gun, and then he paused and he said, on that day, a future bishop of the Catholic Church and a future pope of the Catholic Church were shooting at each other. And then he said, thank God they were both lousy shots. I never forgot that. I thought that was really terrific. I bring you greetings from California. Thank me for the weather. The land of Arnold. My governor can beat up your governor. It's about all he's good for. I'm not going to get political. I really do appreciate the opportunity to come here and speak with you, and I really appreciate such a good turnout on a beautiful, almost spring day here in Baltimore. I really appreciate that I wasn't here last weekend because these are very important issues. And I was asked, and thanks to Joanna and to the Archdiocese of Baltimore and to the hospital for having me, I was asked to set a bit of a broader plate than just specifically end of life. But end of life is certainly a major part of what is going on. Yesterday, there was a lot of news out of Washington State, and it was almost celebratory in nature that 36 people had died by assisted suicide since that state had legalized that practice. And I thought to myself, why would we celebrate? Even if one agrees with that, why would that be cause for celebration? Because it seems to me that it is a indictment. It's an indictment that somehow we have allowed people with terminal illnesses to come to believe that their lives are not worth living anymore. And of course that flies in direct contrast with the whole philosophy of hospice and with Catholic moral teaching in specific. And it strikes me that people think of dying as dead when it is actually a part of living. And if we treat it as a part of living, then people will receive the kind of care they deserve, the kind of love and inclusion they crave. But if we treat it as basically dead, then we're going to start discarding the problem, aren't we? And I fear that that's the direction in which we may be heading. It certainly is not a lost cause. There is a conflict now, a contest, if you will, for the heart and soul of American culture and of certainly medical ethics and bioethics. So why is this happening? There are a few things, and I don't have time to get into all of it. But first off, let's take a look at how the culture has changed in terms of society's purpose. I read a book by Yuval Levin, who's a conservative bioethicist out of, in fact, in Washington, D.C. He served on the President's Council on Bioethics under Leon Cass, and he wrote a book in which he tried to explain to liberals and conservatives each other, that is, on the embryonic stem cell issue. And he had a part of the book that just made a light go off in my head, because I'd been really pondering, why is all of this going on? And he pointed out that the purpose of society used to be, among others, but a very, very important purpose, to help people lead virtuous lives, to help people discern how to best live and how to support each other and live virtuous lives. He said that has shifted. He said today the major purpose, or a major purpose, if not the primary purpose of society, is to make sure nobody suffers. And boy, did that ring a bell in my head, because if there's one thing that is a constant, whether we're dealing with embryonic stem cell research or trying to redefine death so that people like Terry Schiavo can be harvested for organs even though they're not really dead, or assisted suicide, if there's one constant theme, it is we must avoid suffering at all costs. And if that becomes the case, then you're going to have a completely different society than one in which we try to help people live properly, include people, of course these are ideals, and palliate suffering as opposed to eliminate suffering. Because when you decide that eliminating suffering is the purpose of society and even of healthcare, it can very quickly turn into eliminating the sufferer. Because not only are we going to justify in our minds, well, this person's life isn't worth living anymore because they are suffering, but look at what's happening to the family and the anguish of the family as they watch grandma with cancer, say, go through a decline, or as my Uncle Bruno did, die of Alzheimer's disease. And the society, think of all the costs and expenses we're paying for these people who no longer have a productive life and no longer can give back and must only receive. And so a very insidious message goes out. And how many times have we heard an elderly person say, I just don't want to be a burden? Well, how have we allowed people to begin to think that they could ever be a burden on us? That's a really bad thing for society. If we get to a place where after a life of productivity and inclusion, and even if you've never had that, people who are disabled, say from birth, if we begin to start thinking of some of us as burdens, as some of us whose suffering is causing not only their lives to not be worth living, but ours to not be worth caring for them, then we're in very big trouble as a culture. And that is, there are very strong forces pushing us in that direction. I think there's another force, which is that some call it progressive bioethics, but that the purpose of medicine is no longer about healing, palliating, and helping people to live lives that would promote health and wellness, but to facilitate lifestyle choices. And that turns medicine away from being a profession, it seems to me, into a technocracy, an on-demand technocracy in which if somebody comes in and says, I want a child who has, let's say in the future, musical talent, blue eyes, and will not believe in religion, I want you to fix the genes so that's more likely to occur. Well, at that point, medicine has ceased to be medicine, and we are entering a new form of eugenics in which people who don't have certain capacities will be deemed to have less value. And there is a lot of push in that direction. I won't get into that further today, but there's no question that that's an issue. And finally, there is a utilitarianism in bioethics that I will talk a little bit about today. That is pushing the idea that there are some lives that have greater value than others based on a quality of life determination, or as I call it, judgmentalism. And in fact, what wishes to do away with the concept of intrinsic human life, human dignity, and the intrinsic value of equal value of all human life as the fundamental purpose of society and fundamental right, say, of society, and certainly the purpose of medicine. And it creates a two-tiered system of those who have a higher quality than those who have a lower quality, and those who have a lower quality, as you will see in a minute, not only, well, actually 5 minutes, not only lose the right to life, but may even perhaps be used as mere natural resources ripe for the harvest. And these things can get very crass, and they can get very dangerous, and they are in play. They have not prevailed, which is why it's so heartening to see so many people here today, why it's so heartening to see a Catholic hospital building and growing the way it is. But there are going to be challenges that you are all going to face in the next decade and 2 decades to the very concept of medicine that you seek to practice here at St. Agnes Hospital. The stakes of this are made very clear to me in a article. By the way, if you want to see what's going wrong in the culture, read the professional journals. Because you will see some of these ideas appear there first, long before they come into the legislative sphere, long before the courts start making rulings on them, and so forth. And this was an article in the journal called Bioethics by a United Kingdom bioethicist named Alistair Cochrane, December 2009, Bioethics, if you want to take a look at it yourself. And Dr. Cochrane promoted what he called an undignified bioethics, by which he meant a bioethics that does not accept the intrinsic dignity of human life, but seeks to find other reasons to either value or not value a particular individual. And this is a very strong theme in the mainstream view of bioethics today. And the reason I really want to comment on it is because often you will see a lot of euphemisms used and not actually grappling with the potential stakes and consequences of changing our value system so dramatically and radically into an undignified bioethics. But Dr. Cochrane was very candid and clear, and I think correct in terms of the stakes. Certainly incorrect in my view in terms of how we should proceed, but very correct in what the consequences would be if we do proceed as he would like. And he says, he's talking about what it means to have dignity, and he will enter in the middle of his piece. He says, the second important conception of dignity that we need to consider does not see dignity as a form of behavior. That is like, I will act dignified, I won't walk around slobbering with food on my face. I only do that at home for my poor wife. That we need to consider does not see dignity as a form of behavior, but as a property. Under this conception, the possession of dignity by humans signifies that they have an inherent moral worth. In other words, because human beings possess dignity, we cannot do what we like to them, but instead have direct moral obligations toward them. And that's certainly the Catholic view for Catholic hospitals. Indeed, this understanding of dignity is also usually considered to serve as the grounding for human rights, which is a point I pound home every chance I get. As Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states, quote, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, close quote. That is, I totally agree with everything he just wrote in terms of what the inherent dignity means and what is at stake if we decide to reject it. He goes on, this conception of dignity as inherent moral worth certainly seems coherent as an idea. Yeah. Indeed, we can also see why this conception of dignity is employed in certain debates around bioethics. For if all individual human beings possess dignity, then they should not be viewed simply as resources that we can treat however we please. To take an example then, it may be that we could achieve rapid and significant progress in medical science if we were to conduct wide-ranging medical experiments on groups of human beings. However, because human beings have dignity, so it is argued, this means that they possess a particular quality that grounds certain moral obligations and rights. In other words, we can't just take disabled people and decide to start experimenting on them. In fact, that's a human rights obligation that was first actually espoused in the Nuremberg Code in the consequence of the medical atrocities that occurred in the German camps. And we now in the United States have what's called the common rule that dictates what can and cannot be done in terms of human subject testing, and there are international accords in that regard. And by the way, they are being nibbled at and poked at. We don't have time to get into that. But there is a movement afoot to try to weaken those protections. And that flows from a direct consequence of this kind of idea of utilitarianism, this kind of idea of what matters is that I get my lifestyle enhanced in any way I choose, and if that takes a doctor to do it, so be it. And pushing for the idea that anything to not have suffering is valid. He says, even though he acknowledges the stake, then Dr. Cochran actually rejects the idea of dignity. I mean, it would seem to me that once you've set up the stakes, you'd say, oh gosh, we've got to keep it. But there's an agenda here and an ideology that you have to be made aware of in terms of the context of this conference and in terms of the context of the work that's done here at the hospital. He says, if all human beings possess dignity, this extraordinary moral worth, we need some explanation of what it is about the species Homo sapiens that make them so deserving. When we start looking at particular characteristics that might ground dignity, language use, moral action, sociality, sentience, self-consciousness, and so on, we soon come to see that none of these qualities are in fact possessed by each and every human. We are therefore left wondering why all human beings actually do possess dignity. Now, this is very subtle, but it's important. Because what he is saying is rather than look at all of us and our intrinsic inherent capacities as a species without even getting into the issue of soul and religion and that kind of thing, instead we look at each individual and we can say, well, since what gives us value, special value, say, above the animals? Well, we're moral agents. Okay, that's one, and it's very clearly true. Well, some people are incapable of being moral agents. They've lost those capacities, or they have not yet developed those capacities. Or perhaps they are psychotic, and they have something missing in them so they are utterly amoral or psychopathic. And so he's saying that since each individual doesn't have it, then none of us have it uniquely or intrinsically. Therefore, each of us has to earn our rights and our value based on our capacities of the moment. That does destroy universal human rights. Because if our rights and our value are not based on our just merely being human, and that being human means we have intrinsic value and equal moral worth, if we each have to earn our capacity day by day by day, and then we can actually either, if we haven't developed it or lose it, then lose value, there's no way to have universal human equality anymore. Now, the discrimination and oppression won't be based on things of the past, such as race. It'll be based on quality of life, against people with disabilities, people like Terry Schiavo, newborn infants, and so forth, particularly if the newborn infants are born with disabilities, and certainly unborn life. So these are the stakes that are here, And we have to look at this not as a case-by-case, individual-by-individual measuring, but we all have it. Because these values, these things that he mentioned, among others, are intrinsic to our natures if we are given time to develop them or unless we lose them because of illness or injury. They are who we are. They are intrinsic to us and only us in the known universe. There are no other moral agents that we are aware of, at least in the corporeal sense, being aware of, in the known universe. And I think this idea of human exceptionalism is extraordinarily important as we move forward in the 21st century. He goes on to say, obviously, given controversies over abortion, stem cell research, genetic interventions, animal experimentation, euthanasia, and so on, bioethics does need to engage in debates over which entities possess moral worth and why. That is, we're going to be stood up next to animals and trees and everything, and those kind of capacities that those in power think matter will give value, and if you don't have those capacities, then you don't have value. But these are best conducted by using the notion of moral status and arguing over the characteristics that warrant possession of it. Simply stipulating that all and only human beings possess its inherent moral worth because they have dignity is arbitrary and unhelpful. It is unhelpful if you want to be able to kill people. It is unhelpful if you want to be able to harvest people. It is particularly unhelpful if you want to create a society in which we do not have equal dignity for various purposes under the sun. And then he argues, I urge for an undignified bioethics. And if he gets it, then none of us is safe. Because at some point, all of us, unless we are hit by lightning and killed like that, or hit by a truck, may lose those capacities that the big-brained among us think are important. And we've seen this this idea being pitched for well more than 10 years, the idea of personhood theory, Peter Singer and so forth. The idea is that if you are not self-aware over time or do not have the ability to value your own life, then your life has lower value. And that means that you don't have the right to life, and in fact, you might actually be used as a natural resource. And so we've seen advocacy for redefining death to include a diagnosis of persistent vegetative state like Terri Schiavo, even though 40% of those diagnoses are incorrect. And to say that Terri Schiavo did not have intrinsic dignity was what actually was underlying that whole battle. And her family sure thought she had intrinsic dignity, and they fought, and they fought, and they fought. And when they lost, it was so heartbreaking to Mr. Schindler, Bob, I know the family well, that he ended up with such high blood pressure he died of a stroke. So that tragedy not only caused the life of, do you remember her smile? Caused the life of a helpless woman to be slowly dehydrated to death over 14 days. She was in a hospice even though she wasn't dying. She was only dying because they were taking away her food and water. If you sealed these doors and didn't give us food and water for 14 days, we'd be terminally ill too. And then when she died, it was so agonizing for the family that it led to a second casualty. Silver lining is Bobby Schindler. I don't know if any of you have ever seen him speak. Her brother has become a tremendous advocate for the intrinsic dignity of human life and for protecting the lives of the disabled. But we see, again, with my maxim about professional journals, this is Critical Care Magazine, Critical Care Medicine, which is the professional journal for the intensive care doctors. To Harvard physicians, we propose that individuals who desire to donate their organs and who are either neurologically devastated or imminently dying should be allowed to donate their organs without first being declared dead. Now, that's not happening now in the hospitals, but it is being urged upon us at some of the world's most notable medical and bioethical journals. Here's another one, and then I'll move on. This is from The Lancet, which is a UK medical journal. Whoops, that's one about infanticide. Isn't life fun? Should organs from patients in permanent vegetative state be used for transplantation? The answer, yes. Quote, if the legal definition of death were to be changed to include comprehensive irreversible loss of higher brain function it would be possible to take the life of a patient, or more accurately, to stop the heart, since the patient would be defined as dead, by a lethal injection and then remove organs needed for transplantation and so forth. And that gets us to the question that I think is very important. What happened to the Hippocratic Oath? What happened to the Hippocratic Oath? Now, we know the Hippocratic Oath proscribes abortion, it proscribes assisted suicide, it pushes for an ethic that says you shall not harm your patient as a medical professional, of course aimed at doctors, but I think all medical professionals are under it. And there are many, many medical professionals today who wish to simply practice Hippocratic medicine and be part of a Hippocratic healthcare team, which would allow them not to do some of these things we've been talking about. Unfortunately, the Hippocratic Oath itself is rarely taken by physicians anymore. The last study I saw was maybe 13% take the Hippocratic Oath. In fact, most medical schools will, because it's a tradition, will issue an oath to the students, but it's so watered down it might as well be pablum, and it doesn't say anything. Meanwhile, among some in the intelligentsia, the Hippocratic Oath itself is under attack. The maxims and the principles of the oath. I brought along with me an article by Sherwin Newland, who is a very famous and good physician from Yale. He's a bioethicist. And several years ago out of the Netherlands, back in 2000, they did a study, and they said that, gee, you know what? Euthanasia leads to side effects. Things like convulsions. I mean, beyond death, right? Things like convulsions and vomiting and not dying over extended periods. And there really are, it's not just always this little, we just go to sleep and die kind of thing. And the answer in the New England Journal of Medicine, where this was published, was, we better teach doctors how to kill better then. Can you imagine a continuing education course on how to make sure your patient dies quickly? What drugs to use to make sure they stop breathing or their heart stops beating? Hippocrates is spinning in his grave like a gyroscope. And here's what Dr. Newland said in terms of defending euthanasia and assisted suicide. Quote, many opponents of these practices point to the Hippocratic Oath and its prohibition on hastening death. But those who turn to the oath in an effort to shape or legitimize their ethical viewpoints must realize that the statement has been embraced over approximately the past 200 years far more as a symbol of professional cohesion than for its content. Its pithy sentences, can you imagine being more denigrating? Its pithy sentences cannot be used as all-encompassing maxims to avoid the personal responsibility inherent in the practice of medicine. Ultimately, a physician's conduct at the bedside is a matter of individual conscience. If that's so, doctors are no longer professionals. Because one of the things that marks a professional is that professional doesn't necessarily take his or her value system and apply it. That there are professional rules and regulations and ethics that apply. For example, I'm a lawyer, and I thank you for not holding that against me. But if I had a client and this happened, that I thought, oh boy, I took the wrong side of this case, that doesn't mean I can just say, well, sorry, you're on your own, pal. I have to still vigorously assert for that client. And in doing so, another obligation is I cannot allow that client to knowingly perjure himself on the stand. Now, if it was just up to me, well, I want to win this case and I don't care how I do it, which does sometimes happen, I admit, then none of that goes away. But that would also mean that lawyers cease to be professionals and you can just become good speakers. Same thing with doctors. And I think when I read that sometimes to lay audiences, there's a gasp, because we all know that the Hippocratic Oath isn't just a little maxim for doctors to take. It's a protection of patients. It is particularly a protection of the most vulnerable patients who can know that they will not be looked askance upon by their own physicians as people with lives not worthy of being lived. And we reject those values at our own risk. And certainly, if we reject those values, we're rejecting Catholic medical practice and Catholic moral teaching, because what the Hippocratic Oath promotes and what Catholic, as I understand it, moral philosophy and Catholic medical practice promote dovetail perfectly. So what's the answer here? It seems to me, and this is what I was asked to focus a little bit upon today, is we really need to think very seriously about promoting conscience clauses to protect people in the medical professions who really want to still practice Hippocratic medicine, who really still want to practice medicine along the Catholic ideal of Catholic hospitals and Catholic medical practice. I mean, think about where we are today. There are more than 1 million abortions each year. We now have, as I mentioned earlier, doctors intentionally prescribing drugs for use in suicide, not for palliation, not for healing, but for killing. In the Netherlands and Belgium and Luxembourg, physicians lethally inject patients, which is where the assisted suicide movement ultimately heads. And Dutch doctors are now committing infanticide. They are killing babies born with serious disabilities or terminal conditions. And this is known as the Groningen Protocol. It is actually being public. It's not legal technically. Nothing is done about it, to the point that the doctors at the Groningen Medical Center, University Medical Center in the Netherlands, published their protocol in which they proudly published the criteria they use to decide whether or not to kill a baby. Some bioethicists call this post-birth abortion. And that's happening now, and the Groningen Protocol was published with great respect by the New England Journal of Medicine, which again shows you that some of these threats are coming from the highest level of the leadership of medicine today. Embryonic stem cell research is federally funded, which requires the destruction of early embryos, potentially leading to medical procedures in which physicians treat patients with cells derived from ending human life. What happens if these treatments come to pass and you're a practicing doctor in your office, and somebody comes to you and says, I want that embryonic stem cell treatment? That's a real potential for the future. There's active research now into human cloning, not only for that purpose, but for genetic engineering, which could also lead to fetal farming, that is, gestating fetuses in artificial wombs for use in organ transplant medicine and this kind of thing. Fertility doctors are now testing human embryos before implanting them, looking for things even like hair color or eye color, and discarding the embryos that don't make muster, not just in terms of health, which also happens, but even now in terms of enhancement or cosmetic issues. In the future, we will see, if we're not careful, fetal farming that I just mentioned, organ harvesting from people with PVS that I just mentioned is a possibility. There's something called body integrity identity disorder, sometimes called amputation wannabe. These are people suffering a terrible, anguishing mental illness in which their self-image is as an amputee. And they are obsessed with having their healthy limb cut off so they can be that amputee they were always meant to be. And it is a terrible condition, and now you see some in bioethics, still a minority view, but some beginning to say, well, a proper treatment would be to cut off that healthy limb. And if you don't think I'm right, go look it up on Google, and it'll turn your hair my color. And doctors may face this dilemma of, do I do this amputation on this healthy limb, or do I get sued for imposing my religious or my moral views on patients? So these things are coming down the road very, very quickly. And it seems to me that also we're also beginning to see a push for forcing doctors to do these kinds of things. Right now in the United States, no doctor is forced to perform an abortion. Even in New York, when Mayor Bloomberg said, well, we're going to make all OBGYN residents be trained in abortion because we want to make sure there's enough doctors to do these procedures, he put in a conscience clause saying, however, if somebody has a religious objection or a strong moral objection, they do not need to take this training. That's kind of allowing a comity that I think is essential, particularly for people who want to practice Hippocratic medicine. But that's beginning to change. We now see in Victoria, Australia, for example, a new law that says that if a patient approaches a doctor for an abortion, that doctor must either perform that abortion or must find a doctor that physician knows will perform an abortion. In other words, in Victoria, Australia, every doctor must be complicit in abortion if asked. And if they refuse, they are in big trouble. In California, where I come from, there was a bill promoted, AB 2747, that redefined terminal illness as 1 year left to live, and in its original iteration said that it is up to the doctor to tell the patient everything that the patient can do because of terminal illness, including voluntary self-starvation and what they called palliative sedation, which they misdiagnosed. Palliative sedation is a proper palliative technique when used for proper symptoms. It isn't intended to kill, but sometimes when there are, and maybe some of the doctors here will talk about this later, that if somebody has severe agitation, or in those rare cases where pain can't be alleviated, you can, at the end of life, put people into a coma so they don't experience that. But the point is not to kill people. But this bill defined it, realizing 1 year left to live, as being put in a coma and having food and water deprived. In other words, putting in a coma and dehydrating to death. And that bill said that every doctor must do whatever was demanded by the patient with regard to end-of-life care, or if they refuse to do it based on moral grounds, find a doctor who would, kind of like the Victoria, Australia abortion thing. Only this would allow patients to say, you put me under and you dehydrate me to death. It didn't pass in that way, but that shows you the future where things are heading. In Washington State, where, as we discussed earlier, there is now assisted suicide, physicians are given a specific right to say no, as are medical facilities. In fact, the Providence Medical Centers, Catholic hospitals in Washington, have very courageously and publicly said, not on our facility, we're not going to participate in that. And there's been a really very heartening pushback by doctors going public saying, I'm not going to do this. And I would like to see doctors in Washington State all put plaques in their offices saying, this is an assisted suicide-free zone. Because that needs to be, that just because it's legal doesn't make it right and doesn't make it the best thing for patients. And doctors need to lead the charge saying, no, this is wrong, and I will not participate. And they're given that specific right under the law. But guess what? Pharmacies do not have that right. Moreover, because it's not mentioned in the law, moreover, there was a case in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals where anything is possible, in which a Catholic pharmacy company, a small company that owned a few pharmacies, and they were Catholic, said, we do not want to dispense the morning after pill, and we're not going to, because it violates our consciences. The Ninth Circuit District Court said, yes, that is protected by the First Amendment. The state of Washington passed a regulation saying every single legal prescription written must be filled out by every pharmacy. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals said that must be followed. It does not violate religious liberties because it is a general prohibition or a general rule, not one aimed at Catholics. Right. Of course it was, but that's what the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals said. So, the case was about the morning after pill, but it would also apply to a lethal prescription because that is legal in the state of Washington. That means under the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, if that ruling sticks, every pharmacy in that state is legally required to issue lethal prescriptions knowing it would result in the death of a patient. There's no conscience clause for the pharmacies in that law, or certainly in that ruling. Now, how that would affect individual pharmacists, it might be different, but for pharmacies, the businesses, I think they're on the hook. I think they're on the hook. And there is already pressure because of what I described as the pushback in Washington State. There's already pressure to basically force doctors to participate in assisted suicide. There's been some rumbling from the assisted suicide advocates in op-ed pieces and this kind of thing. And I really, especially if this thing ever becomes really popularly accepted, and with the idea that what matters is I get to do what I want, facilitate my lifestyle decisions, and if doctors are the ones to do it, then they're the ones to do it. If we turn medicine from a profession into a technocracy, that could very easily happen. And unfortunately, you're beginning to see also medical professional associations supporting this concept of on-demand medical practice. and requiring doctors to forego their own value system in order to fulfill the patient's, quote, choice desires. With regard to abortion, the Committee on the Ethics of the American College of Obstetrics and Obstetricians and Gynecology have basically said, physicians, and this is from their ethics panel, physicians and other healthcare providers have a duty to refer patients in a timely manner to other providers if they do not feel they can in conscience provide the standard reproductive services that patients request. In an emergency in which referral is not possible or might negatively have an impact on a patient's physician or mental health, of course, is open to a lot of things, providers have an obligation to provide medically indicated and requested care. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch, when George Bush, at the end of his term, his Health and Human Services, put out a conscience clause in the federal regulations that said anybody who receives federal money, a hospital or facility, must not and cannot discriminate against an individual medical health care provider, and that's not just doctors, who refuse based on conscience to perform a particular service. So there was a non-discrimination clause. One of the first things President Obama did when he took office was begin the process of revoking that conscience clause. That conscience clause has not yet been revoked, but is certainly in the process. And really alarming was an editorial in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch in the face of the Bush conscience clause, which bluntly asserted, quote, doctors, nurses, and pharmacists choose professions that put patients' rights first. If they foresee that priority becoming problematic for them, they should choose another profession. So what is really coming along in the next 10 years will be whether or not people in this room who believe in a Hippocratic value system, whether they're nurses or doctors or other healthcare professionals, will be allowed to stay in medicine. Because there are very powerful forces that want to put you in a position of choosing. Do you choose the culture of death and participate and cooperate in it? Do you choose to participate in this either by doing it or referring? Or do you say, no, that's not proper, and if that's the case, out? And there's one way to protect the current comity, and that's conscience clauses. And I have a couple of thoughts on what they should look like, and then I'll shut my pie hole here. I think conscience clauses should be legally binding. I think the rights of conscience should apply to medical facilities, such as this hospital, and nursing homes as well as individuals. Except in rare and compelling circumstances, for example, perhaps an ectopic pregnancy in which a patient's life is at stake, no medical professional should be compelled to perform or participate in procedures or treatments that take human life. And of course, an ectopic pregnancy is a double effect situation. The rights of conscience should apply most strongly in elective procedures, that is, medical treatments not required to extend the life or prevent serious physical harm to the patient. It should be the procedure that is objectionable, not the patient. In this way, for example, a physician should not refuse to treat a lung cancer patient because the patient smoked. That's beginning to happen over in the UK, by the way. Or maintain the life of a patient in a vegetative state because they believe that people with profound impairments do not have a life worth living. No medical professional should be forced to participate in a medical procedure intended primarily to facilitate the patient's lifestyle preferences or desires, and that's in contrast to maintaining life or treating a disease or injury. In order to avoid conflicts and respect patient autonomy, whenever feasible, patients should be advised in advance of a professional facility's conscientious objection to performing or participating in legal medical treatments or procedures. In other words, if somebody came to this hospital and this hospital was maintaining a strict Catholic medical practice, patients should be made aware of it. I mean, that's right, and that should be done. Again, the assisted suicide free zone plaque idea in doctors' offices. The rights of conscience should be limited to bona fide medical facilities such as hospitals, skilled nursing centers, and hospices, and to licensed medical professionals such as physicians, nurses, and pharmacists. You know, it's a sad day when medical professionals and facilities have to be legally protected from coerced participation in life-terminating medical procedures. But there's no denying the direction in which the scientific and moral currents are flowing. With ethical views in society and medicine growing increasingly polyglot, with the sanctity of human life increasingly under a cloud in the medical context, and given the establishment's marked hostility toward medical professionals who adhere to traditional Hippocratic maxims, conscience clauses may be the only shelter protecting traditional morality in medicine. That and leadership by example, which is showing how to properly care and love people, for example, who are dying, which is what I'm sure the rest of this seminar will be about. Thank you for your attention.